in the previous videos, we've indulged in the horrors of the labyrinth by exploring Hellraiser 1, Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, and the terrible, fucking atrocious,
and most hellish,
yes, Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth. If you haven't seen that video and want to see a couple of angry assholes talking about how much a movie sucks, then check out Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, or rather, looking back on that, our video, linked below, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty much, I think, where everybody, or at least we do, think that the series began to start its heavy decline. Now, while I think that Hellraiser 3 is definitely among the worst, if not the worst of the entire series, there were still a few nuggets to be had, which we will explore in our other videos as we continue viewing the Hellraiser films again and eventually get to the newest one, which we haven't seen, and explore that, see if it's any good. Hopefully it is. But some people don't know that there's an alternative timeline to the Hellraiser movies, namely one that ignores Part 3 and everything that followed after it, which is, if you've seen Part 3 especially, and some of the later installments, a fucking blessing in disguise. It's just like, thank crap somebody fucking fixed this. And that somebody was Scott Joplin.
Yeah, it was.
He wrote a little rag about it. You want to hear it? Here it goes. Ding, 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 ding. It sucked.
It's weird because it's 1 minute long, but it's...
But it covers everything.
It covers everything.
No, but in reality, Clive Barker, the man, the legend, my favorite writer, gay man extraordinaire.
Oh, yeah.
Got to just point out every time that he's gay, and I don't even give a fuck. I would blow him just because he's Clive Barker.
All right.
Because he's that awesome. But Clive Barker, man, he got together with some comics folks down at Boom Comics, and he said, hey, here's an idea. How about we ignore that fucking piece of shit called Hellraiser 3 that I hated,
yeah, and
write something completely different. And the folks down there saying, hey, yeah, I like the idea. I say, because they're gangsters from the 30s. And, yeah, man, what a fucking great move. Now, I didn't get to read this series when it came out, but, you know, because I was locked up. But I did get to read it finally after all these years. And I got to say, this is the fucking history that should have happened after Part 2. Now, the series is simply called Clive Barker's Hellraiser. It's been recently released in this omnibus edition, which covers the first 22 issues, and the majority of the main storyline is here. Though, it concludes in 12 more issues called The Dark Watch, which will eventually be in a second omnibus, but for now is only available in these trade paperbacks. Another 12 issues added to the mix. And together they form the core storyline. There is another series called The Road Below that takes place in between stories in this series, and Bestiary, which is an anthology series. And I'll catch up with those eventually, but this is the core storyline. And it follows the events of Hellraiser 1, the movie, and Hellbound Hellraiser 2. And wisely decides to just fucking ignore everything after that. Now, what is so great about this series, and I'm already giving this an absolute winner rating of, you know, something high. I'm going to give it like a solid, altogether, like a solid 8.8. I would say a 9, but there was a few moments in there that don't reach 9 status. But as far as the history of this fucking storyline goes, this is probably the best visual way to go about it. Now, myself, I prefer the book version of the storyline, which is the Hellbound Heart, followed by Scarlet Gospels. But we're talking the movies here. This is what this whole series is about. And this provides the closest thing to a movie, which is a comic book, you know, that intermediary between books and the screen. But the story basically picks up decades later and follows our main character for the first 2 movies, Kirsty, as she continues her quest against hell. Yes, we find out that Kirsty has not ended her pursuit of the people, or I should say, the demons that ruined her life. And this, from the get-go, gives you a feeling of coming back home, which is something that Part 3 didn't do. It just completely threw out everything they had established and just brought in a slew of fucking characters that you gave 0 fucks about. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, didn't develop them, didn't make you care for them,
And they sucked.
and they sucked. So already you're in good ground, as it brings back familiar characters, and then it touches on the mythology so beautifully by bringing in familiar notes, explaining things a lot more in depth. Everything from the gatekeeper to the engineer, all that stuff is touched upon. The life of the Cenobites, their religion, where they stand, what they are, how they think, everything is expounded upon and fleshed out in ways that the movies had not done up to that point. In essence, this is Clive Barker fixing all the wrongs. And what is ultimately most clear to me is that, especially in the initial 22 book arc, is that he's not only righting the wrongs, he's saying fuck you to Hellraiser 3 by taking some of the points of it, namely the idea of hell, Pinhead on Earth, hell on Earth, and giving it legitimacy, making it something that works versus that fucking mess that the movie was. And on top of that, he does something that I've always liked from Clive Barker. There's always like a dark Christian background to everything he writes. In terms of the mythology he sets his stuff in, there's always, and you're familiar with this because you've read a few short stories, a book, and I've of course told you about some of the stuff, and you've even played video games that he was in charge of, and he always kind of touches on this old religious context to bring forth horrors and the dark fantastic, which he's so good at. Well, he does that here, which is something Part 3 didn't do because it was so fucking shallow and stupid that it just failed to do anything really at all other than annoy the fuck out of us. But this fixes all that, man, and it gives characters, one, something to do, and two, an incredible depth. Most notably, the character of Pinhead, which is, we begin to understand him in a completely different way than we had previously. And he truly becomes an antagonist versus a cog in the works, which is really what he was in the first two films. As impressive as he was, as scene-stealing as he could be, you understood he was just part of a bigger picture. Here we have somebody that is driven to be the big picture, and he really becomes a villainous entity, which, in some ways he hadn't really been in the movies. Yes, he was an antagonist of forms, but not to the level where he was like, that's the bad guy.
Oh, they tried with Part 3.
Well, they definitely tried with Part 3 and they failed. And that's why I say that this is one where he fixes that. He addresses that problem in the right way, and it just fucking works. Now, it's a little heavy on philosophy, and it doesn't feed you things direct to your fucking brain. You kind of have to put the puzzle together. And it's also not written in the standard comic book form, or I should say framed in the standard comic book form. It literally works like a movie. The cuts to different places work that way. So it's very cinematic in a lot of ways. But at one point, the material becomes so dense that it might lose some people if you're not really paying attention or have begun to grasp exactly where this is headed and the implications of that. But if you do, if he doesn't lose you, and I recommend that if you do read this and you get to the point where you're kind of like, well, wait a minute, where am I standing here? That you go back and, because again, it's very much, I don't know if you experience this, let me put it this way, I don't know if you experience this with comics, but sometimes you read the comics and you don't even see the pictures. I don't know if you do.
Oh,
that.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it just becomes like a natural thing. Like, you understand what's there without even seeing it. This one, you kind of have to see what's going on sometimes. So you can't read it in the same way that you read most comics. Despite them being a visual art, yeah, for some reason that happens. You just kind of, you understand naturally what's going on. Here it's kind of like you have to decipher things. And especially when there's dialogues between people, there's a lot of insinuation, a lot of allusions to things, a lot of references to things that some people may not be familiar with and that you might have to get familiar with. But if you can do that, if you could get into the spirit of that, man, it's quite the ride. And on top of that, it does something wonderful. It does fan service incredibly well. It doesn't just bring people back because, oh, look, we saw them. When they come back, people like Tiffany from Part 2 things like that. When people come into the picture, you're glad to see them there, and the way they come back, it's like, damn, that's fucking cool. When Tiffany came back, I was like, damn, that's awesome. That's not just, oh well, let's tick this box. It felt awesome. And for me, one of the greatest fucking things was when at first it gave you hints. If you're familiar with Clive Barker's works, it gives you hints that Harry D'Amour, which is one of his most famous characters in his novels, is involved in this some way. And they treat it well at first, as in suggesting he's worked with Kirsty before in some respects, but they keep him away from the story. And it becomes, at one point, I was like, oh, that was just a cool tip of the hat, if you will. But then he actually comes into the story, and by then I'm like, I'm prepped for it. And even then, they hold back on his involvement until the series The Dark Watch, when he becomes pivotal to the storyline. And again, we begin to see an even bigger picture. Anything that is left unclear in this is definitely answered here. And wow, what a finish. Epic, large. This is something they could have never feasibly done on screen, no matter how much money they threw at the series. So this is a great way to see this happen. A lot of people want to see the Scarlet Gospels, the novel version that follows up the Hellbound Heart, which Hellraiser was based on, come to the screen. But even that would never happen because it would be ludicrously expensive to try to bring that to life. Same here, but we should be glad that there is an alternative that doesn't stink like Hellraiser 3 does, because this is fucking fascinating. It's great. I was so glad to see that. And if you're a fan of Clive Barker's work, man, you're going to get treated to such a fucking ride. Not only does Harry D'Amour come back, but Butterfield, if you've ever read or seen Lord of Illusions, comes into the picture. There's just a lot of references to Clive Barker stuff, and it's just shocking that you think even a fraction of this would have been a good part 3. Instead, we got that bullshit movie. But be glad that there is an alternative. I do give this a very high rating. It is a quick read, but I stress, don't speed through it like you normally would a comic, because there is much there's a lot of meat in it to chew upon and ponder on. And there's even elements in here that if you're not familiar with them, you might have to go and seek them out, which in my opinion is good. If something makes you want to entertain the idea of research, well, that's something that very few things achieve. But yeah, man, fantastic. Visually speaking, great art through and through. The covers are amazing, and the art is handled by a variety of people. It's more comic bookish in The Dark Watch, and it's a lot more visceral and stylistic in the first 22 series run. But overall, it's fantastic. The designs for the creature, it's appropriately bloody for anybody that's worried about that, which makes sense in this world. But it never goes into the arena that part 3 did, which was, hey, let's get stupid with this. It's always very much in the appropriate places. And some of the images evoked here are, it's just like when you first saw the Cenobite. It's like, wow, that's amazing, versus that's disgusting. So yeah, man, highly recommend it. Check that out.
I hear the next run they're gonna have is gonna be a Camerahead spinoff.
Dude, if they ever bring Camerahead back, I'm gonna fucking kick somebody in the nuts.
Yep.
Also, if you're a comic book fan, you're familiar with the idea that, or I should say with the history of Clive Barker and Hellraiser comics. Back in the 90s, he wrote for the imprint at Marvel called Epic, a series of not only Clive Barker-based comics, everything from Nightbreed to Hokeman Hex, etc., but he also wrote Pinhead and Hellraiser comics, and therein expanded the mythos quite extensively. That's another amazing thing about this series, that the fan service and references don't limit themselves to the first 2 movies and the worlds of Clive Barker himself, but they also heavily imply, without being too direct about it because of rights issues, that everything that happened in the 90s Epic's Marvel series happened. And this is just that much later in the series, which is super fucking badass, because you don't have to ignore all that cool shit that happened in those comics. And on top of that, if you never got a chance to read those comics or are not familiar with them, they're not essential. You know, it's just that if you have, that's just an extra little flavor thrown into the mix, which is super fucking cool, man. I mean, I can't rave enough about it. Great series. But that's my thoughts on it. I hope you go and check that out. In the meantime, we're going to continue down the Hellraiser path as we explore next Hellraiser Bloodline, which is a sequel, the movie that followed the atrocious Hellraiser 3. But, hey, it actually was kind of good. We're going to revisit
Or is it?
Or, yeah, we're going to revisit it, and will my thoughts change on that? I don't know. Have you seen it before?
Yeah, I saw it a couple years ago again. I've
so,
seen it like 3 times.
Okay, so we're going to revisit it and see if our thoughts change, because we both liked it when we first saw it. I actually quite enjoy it. I think it's very wrongly maligned, but we'll see. Maybe that'll change, and then we'll go on down the line from there. Anyway, this has been Ahab and the Goontick talking a little Hellraiser alternative timeline, Boom Comics. Hit like, share, subscribe, and those notification buttons, because we're out.